you read the title. I was not expecting to like Red Dead Redemption 2. Over the Christmas break, I decided to play games that were a bit out of my comfort zone, and of course when scouring the web for good games, Red Dead Redemption 2 is something that always came up. I remember when Red Dead 2 came out in 2018, but I thought it was just a cowboy shooter game. Nothing too deep story or character-wise. It wasn't until I actually picked up the game to see what all the hype was about. And oh boy, was my first impression incorrect. Yes, the game still includes a lot of cowboy outlaws and shootouts, but it's so much more than that. I genuinely wasn't expecting to fall in love with the characters and their backgrounds. I mean, I'm even on Arthur Morgan talk, which we can talk about that a bit later. I also didn't expect the story to be so immersive and thought-provoking, but in case you haven't played the game, allow me to set the scene. The game takes place in a fictional representation of the United States during the 1800s. You follow the everyday life of Arthur Morgan, who is one of those outlaw cowboys I mentioned earlier. Arthur is a part of the Vanderlyn gang, headed by a man of the same name, Dutch Vanderlyn. The gang moves from place to place, all over the West to escape urbanization, prosecution, and the infamous O'Driscolls and Pinkertons. Now, if you're a bit confused, don't worry, I was too at the beginning. The game really throws you into the mix, but trust me, everything becomes a lot clearer after you play a couple more hours. The game's story is told through chapters, with the beginning and ending of them corresponding to when the gang decides to leave their current location. For example, at the beginning they start off in snowy Coulter. They were forced to move from their previous location due to a conflict with the law. So now they're heading to a warmer place called Horseshoe Overlook, where they stay for chapter 2 until they cause trouble in a nearby town called Valentine, which is the best town in my opinion. Leviticus Cornwall, who works with the Pinkertons, confronts the gang at a saloon in town. Bada bing bada boom, one thing leads to another, and needless to say, it's time for the gang to pack up and leave. Looking for a new location, they stumble across Clemens Point, and the cycle begins again. Explore a new town and complete missions until you're forced to leave. Rinse and repeat. Within this camp are people that Arthur has known from a very young age, such as Dutch and Hosea. The two actually took Arthur under their wing and really showed him how to live and make a name for himself. But there's also others who join your camp later on. For example, Sadie, who we met in chapter 1, but you don't really interact with her until chapter 3. Sadie was someone the gang saved early on in the game, after her husband was killed by the O'Driscolls. At the beginning of the game, the Vanderlyn gang seems to be outlaws with a vague sense of morals. They repeatedly say they steal from people who steal from people, but this isn't always the case. So they're outlaws and it's 1899. Is it really worth talking about morals? No. But this slow shift, or rather spiral into madness, starts to take shape around the end of chapter 3. The Vanderlyn settlement that was once a bit optimistic and upbeat slowly becomes dark and desperate. Now, before I jump into the story and the characters fully, let's talk about the gameplay. Don't worry, if you haven't played the game, you can watch this video a bit further, and I will let you know when to click off to avoid spoilers. The story is mainly told through missions. Missions are placed on your map with the name of the person you need to interact with in order to start them. Yellow missions mean they contribute to the main story, while the white missions mean it doesn't. Honestly, even the side missions feel like they contribute to the main story though, as some of them contribute to character progression, or just give more context as to what happened in the past. I would highly recommend trying to complete all missions that come your way. As you know, immersion is a big part of why this game is so good. When you're not completing missions, you can do things to raise your honor. Yes, this game has an honor system that reflects how well liked you are. For example, you can go around greeting everyone and that will raise your honor. You can even complete random tasks from NPCs when they approach you, and this will raise your honor even more. However, the opposite is also true. You can lower your honor by doing degenerate activities, such as robbing or assaulting people, or simply by declining someone in need of help. Trust me, I declined to help someone once, and that low honor bell struck fear into my heart. Now, if you're anything like me, you'll probably aim for a high honor run. I feel like high honor just fits Arthur. I don't have a reference for low honor Arthur, but I feel like he's meant to be a bit of a tsundere. But in case getting the worst version of Arthur isn't important to you, maybe the bounty system will be enough of a deterrent. Bounties are a big part of the game. If you commit a crime, you will be punished by the law, if they can catch you. I remember the first mission where this was introduced, and I was literally sitting at the scene of the crime, looting a house because I didn't think anyone was searching for me. I was like, who are we searching for? And Why is the map red? When I got outside and saw a bunch of horses pull up and Arthur was getting shot at, I was like, oh, they're looking for me. Depending on the crime and how much death and destruction you caused, a bounty will be placed on your head. It can be anywhere from $5 to... honestly, I'm not even sure. I think my highest was about $195. You can remove bounties by going to the post office and paying them off, or by not committing crimes in the first place. Or at least wear a mask when you do. In terms of missions, a lot of them end in a gunfight and an escape. If you know me, you know I suck at shooting, so you bet your bottom dollar aim assist was incredibly useful. It's pretty much auto-targeting, and I turned the aim up to wide. This made these sections a lot more enjoyable, especially when I was still learning the controls. There's also Deadeye, which slows down time and allows you to aim and mark the people you want to shoot with accuracy. If you happen to fail a mission 3 times, the game also allows you to skip that section. I thought this was really nice. The first time I saw this was on one of those horse race missions, where I was racing on a horse I literally just picked up, meaning my horse ran out of stamina extremely quickly. Which, I should also mention, horses are the main mode of transportation throughout the game. Duh. These portions of the game were some of my favorite parts. I loved running through the mountains and looking at the night sky, and or just listening to the characters talk on the way to our destination. There is a way to unlock fast travel later on by upgrading Dutch's camp, but you're not forced to utilize it. Okay, now that we went over the gameplay, allow me to really dive into the story and the characters. Click away now if you haven't played the game. I highly recommend playing this game without spoilers, but continue to watch at your own risk. As I said earlier, the camp starts off pretty hopeful as they've escaped prosecution in their previous town. Things are seemingly looking up for them. However, it's not until the end of chapter 3 where we are starting to see signs of distress. In one of the final missions of the chapter, Dutch, Micah, and Arthur go to meet with Colm O'Driscoll, the person that killed the woman Dutch loved. Dutch and Micah meet the man face to face, and Arthur stays on top of the cliff as a sniper. Things seem to be going okay, until someone sneaks up on Arthur and knocks him out cold. They carry him to their encampment and torture him, telling Arthur to his face that this is merely a ploy to get Dutch to come and rescue him. Arthur is able to escape and makes his way back to Clemens Point. Not going to lie, I was a bit disappointed when this happened. I wish Dutch and the gang actually came to rescue Arthur, but in retrospect, I guess it makes sense why things unfolded this way. From here on out, there's a palpable tone shift. Things just don't feel quite right. At least in my opinion. I was on edge waiting for something to happen, and I'm sure Arthur felt the same way as well. In one of the last missions of chapter 3, we find out that Jack, John Marston's son, is missing. This throws the whole camp into a frenzy, and they take a ride down to the Braithwaite Manor, the only place they feel Jack could be, due to some past instances with the owner of the manor, Catherine Braithwaite. This ride down to the mansion is so iconic and memorable, especially because it feels like one of the only times it was completely justified for them to go in guns blazing. The raid ends with Jack not being found in the house, and Dutch dragging Catherine Braithwaite out by her hair. After some threatening, she tells us that she gave Jack to Angelo Bronte in Saint Denis, and as you can guess, that's our next stop. But before we make our way there, the Pinkertons show up again, and this forces the gang to leave Clemens Point and take residence at Shady Belle. But back to Saint Denis. We're on the hunt for Angelo Bronte and Jack. Asking around leads to some stern warnings, but also leads us face to face with the man in question. Dutch is being Dutch, stern and threatening, but also trying to play innocent. Bronte can see through his BS, but finds Dutch to be amusing. After running some errands for Bronte, they are able to return Jack back to John and Abigail. The gang starts to become a bit cozy with Bronte, attending fancy parties in mansions and yachts, but this all comes to an end after the gang tries to rob a post office. The police show up almost immediately, indicating this was most likely a setup. Dutch vows to get revenge on Bronte, and Hosea, being the voice of reason, tries to remind Dutch that revenge isn't everything. Sadly, Arthur agrees with Dutch that business is business, and so the pair set out along with John and Lenny to ambush Angelo Bronte at his mansion. When they find Bronte, he tries to plead for forgiveness, but of course it's way too late for that. They drag him out of his mansion and onto a boat. They plan to hold him for ransom, but Angelo Bronte actually ends up schooling Dutch a little bit. This is where I realized, along with everyone else on that boat, that Dutch has fully lost his mind. After hearing Bronte's words, Dutch becomes infuriated and dunks Bronte's head in the water repeatedly, and then holds it there. Of course, Dutch won't learn from his own mistakes and vows to get just enough money to move everyone to Tahiti. After that, they will drop the crime-ridden life they are currently leading. With Bronte dead, Dutch plans to rob a bank in Saint Denis, but this time with the help of many in camp. Hosea and Abigail plan to distract the cops, while the rest of the men do all the dirty work. If you can't see the pattern right now, I don't know what to tell you. But of course the Pinkertons show up once again, and this time it's not pretty. Mr. Milton shoots Hosea, and all hell breaks loose. Things start to go downhill real fast. The gang tries to escape, and during this process, Lenny is shot dead, John gets arrested, and Charles puts himself in danger by drawing attention away from the rest of the gang. Everyone else, Arthur, Dutch, Micah, Bill, and Javier, stow away on a boat, but they won't be going to Tahiti. Instead, they arrive off the coast of an island called Guarma, and by arrive, I really mean get shipwrecked and wash ashore, torn up and exhausted. The gang washes ashore and gets captured by the police, but of course they manage to escape. Well, everyone except for Javier. We actually have to go rescue him. It's during this escape that we learn about the leader of this island, Alberto Fusar, and that they've been tipped off to the Vanderlyn gang's wanted status abroad. No matter where they run, someone is always there to chase them down. To escape the island, they need to defeat Colonel Fusar, and that pretty much sums up the chapter. Once they make it on a boat, they decide to split up and explore different areas for signs of life in the gang. This leads to Arthur going to Shady Belle, where he finds a letter from Sadie, basically telling us the rest of the gang is in Le Quay. Arthur is given a warm welcome, but the others not so much. Especially Bill, who went around asking everyone in town if they knew where the gang was. Oh, Bill. Seconds later, the Pinkertons show up outside our door, we have another shootout, and everyone pretty much agrees it's time to leave. After a couple missions, Arthur isn't doing too hot. He looks pale, skinny, and discolored around the eyes. On his way to meet up with Sadie, he passes out in the street and a kind stranger leads him to the doctor. Arthur has tuberculosis, and in 1899, sadly, there is no cure. So how did Arthur get it? Well, from completing a mission in Chapter 2. Thomas Downs, a sickly man you beat up for owing money, is the reason Arthur is now terminally ill. From this point on, he begins to rapidly lose weight, and everyone in town points out how sick he looks. The doctor says rest is the best course of treatment, but Arthur has people to look after, so he must continue his missions. On the flip side, while plotting to break John out of jail, Molly loses her mind, and rightfully so. Molly and Dutch were a couple, but honestly, it was very one-sided. She was constantly asking others in camp about Dutch's feelings, and it was very obvious that Dutch was extremely cold towards her. Molly has a bit of a mental break and gives out the gang's location to the police. Or so she says. The gang has a rule about being a rat, and despite Arthur's plea to spare her, Miss Grimshaw is the one that ultimately puts a bullet in Molly's back. The camp from this point on is extremely depressing. I honestly found myself never wanting to rest there anymore. No more campfires, no more songs, no more camaraderie. It all just feels hollow. A shell of what it once was. So I guess the next location being named Beaver Hollow is quite fitting. Arthur and Sadie bust John out of jail, Dutch kills Leviticus Cornwall, we escape an oncoming train. Wait, I'm sorry. Dutch kills Leviticus Cornwall? The Leviticus Cornwall? I honestly think this was the breaking point for Arthur. Arthur has been supportive of Dutch even when I feel like deep down, Arthur knew Dutch was losing his mind. But this was a step too far. This was also the point where I really noticed the impact of losing Hosea. Instead of Dutch and Hosea plotting and planning, it's now Dutch and Micah plotting and planning. Micah is an interesting character for all the wrong reasons. He's racist, sexist, and I truly believe nobody in the camp likes him, apart from Dutch that is. It becomes very clear that Micah is enabling Dutch to become very reckless, or sloppy as the others put it. Hosea was always the voice of reason, and with him gone, Dutch is extremely susceptible to negative influence. Dutch also starts to leave behind gang members. At the beginning of the game, Dutch would never leave any of the members for dead, and would help anyone in need. But that is not the case anymore. Sadie and Arthur have to bust John out of jail on their own, and while Dutch said he had a plan, I'm not sure I believe it. Him even being upset that they rescued John is a bit unnerving. The rest of Chapter 6 follows the story of the Wapiti tribe and how they're being screwed over by the American government. Eagleflies teams up with Dutch to seek revenge, and by doing so, he possibly puts the rest of the tribe in danger. Rainfalls, Eaglefly's father, teams up with Charles and Arthur to put a stop to this potential war. The juxtaposition between Dutch and Rainfalls is extremely apparent. Rainfalls actually practices what Dutch used to preach. Specifically, the revenge is a fool's game quote. Rainfalls vows to protect the lives of everyone in the tribe, even if that means taking the longer, more scenic route to get what they want. Dutch is definitely using Eagleflies and the Wapiti tribe as a scapegoat to get some heat off his own back from the government, and Arthur is keen to call him out on this. This split between father and son ricochets throughout the entire group. Micah, Javier, and Bill all side with Dutch, while Sadie, John, and Charles all side with Arthur. This whole pick your side thing gets interrupted when the Pinkertons show up to their camp one last time. Dutch and Micah run off, and John and Arthur escape through the caves. However, while trying to escape, Arthur realizes that both of them cannot make it. Since he's dying and John has a family, it's best that he lets John escape and try to deal with the Pinkertons alone. Only Arthur isn't actually alone, because Micah attacks him out of nowhere. And if you couldn't tell by now, I absolutely hate Micah. Micah and Arthur get into a bit of a scuffle, but of course Arthur is sick and near the end of his life, so this takes quite a toll on him very quickly. When both of them get knocked to the ground, one of their guns goes flying. Arthur uses all of his remaining strength to crawl towards it, but out of nowhere a foot appears. And that foot, of course, belongs to Dutch. Arthur once again tells Dutch that Micah is the real rat. Micah is the one that kept ratting out the gang's location, not Molly. Dutch, being too blinded by God knows what at this point, says nothing and turns around to leave. He left Arthur, someone he claimed to view as a son, to die alone. And here the story of Arthur Morgan comes to an end. The game is not over. In fact, there's another 2 epilogue chapters where you play from John's perspective 8 years later. John is now a ranch hand and decided to give up on a life of killing for the sake of his family, until one day he slowly gets pulled back into it, from protecting the ranch he works for to going on bounty missions with Sadie. Sadie and John vow that if they ever find Micah's location, they'll take him out once and for all. After 2 epilogue chapters, one of which is extremely boring, and the other one slightly more entertaining, we finally get to the final mission where everything goes down. American Venom. Sadie rides to John's house to tell him she knows where Micah is. Abigail begs him not to go, but John feels like he needs to do this one last thing, and I kind of agree. John, Sadie, and Charles take a ride to Mount Hagen, and after fighting his way up the mountain, John stands face to face with Micah. The pair have a bit of a shootout, but to be honest, only Micah's shots land. I genuinely thought something was wrong with my game. But no, this is part of the story. Sadie, who was previously stabbed on the climb up, comes out of nowhere and aims her gun at Micah. Just when we think we've got him cornered, the door of a nearby cabin swings open, and Dutch is there, guns drawn. This leads to a bit of a standoff, where everyone just kind of looks at each other, speaking their piece, until a gun goes off. It's Dutch. Dutch gets the first shot on Micah, and John finishes him off. John thanks Dutch, but no other words are spoken. John retrieves the money from Blackwater, Sadie and Charles recover and go on to live their best lives. This is a satisfying end to the epilogue, and the game in general. Now with the story out of the way, let's dive into the characters, their growth, their motives, and anything else worth noting. Arthur Morgan is of course our main character. Arthur was taken in by Dutch and Hosea at a young age, after both his parents died. This leads to Dutch and Hosea being father figures to Arthur. You can see this in his almost undying loyalty to Dutch, even towards the end of the game. At the beginning of the game, Arthur is a pretty rough and apathetic person. He really doesn't seem to care too much about anything besides money, or if it benefits himself or the gang in general. This same disposition at the beginning of the game actually leads to his downfall towards the end of the game. The mission, Money Lending and Other Sins 3, is the exact mission that changed his life. This is where he's tasked with retrieving a loan from Thomas Downs, a sick man who is obviously on death's door. Mr. Downs begs Arthur to give him more time as he is extremely sick and can't provide for his family. Arthur of course doesn't care, and instead tells the man that he shouldn't have taken the money in the first place if he knew he wouldn't be able to repay it on time. Arthur resorts to beating the man up, sending Mr. Downs' blood flying everywhere. This is the exact moment Arthur unknowingly contracts TB. As we move throughout the game, Arthur gets pale and sick looking, losing a ton of weight in the process. However, it's not until Arthur gets checked out by a doctor that he finally learns the bad news. From this point on, Arthur starts to reflect on life and his past actions. Past interactions play in his head, and he realizes that he doesn't have a lot of time to make things right. I do think this whole wanting to correct or pay for his sins comes from a deep fear of dying Arthur has. In fact, he says this towards the end of the game when talking to a nun. I know I said a nun, but for some reason when I replayed, I got Reverend Swanson. Just ignore it. She tells him not to be afraid, and instead put his energy towards completing an act of love. Arthur puts all his focus on saving the other members of the gang from Duchess mania, especially John, Abigail, and Jack. I think he really latched onto these three in particular, not only because John is the main character of the first game, but because he sees himself and what his life could have been in them. Arthur actually had a son, but he sadly passed away. There's also his relationship with Mary, who we've seen throughout the game. But she left because Arthur would not change his murderous ways. He actually kind of pulled a bit of a Dutch with her, saying he just needs a bit more money before they can run away. But we all know if he never got sick, he probably wouldn't give up his life of crime. So... In the end, Arthur is successful in helping John and his family out of harm's way, but he ultimately meets his demise at the hands of Micah and the betrayal of Dutch once again. I think it's very fitting that he died the same way his victim Thomas Downs did. I love Arthur and his character progression, but that was certainly karma. You can try to change, but the life you've lived will always catch up with you. Dutch is the next character I want to talk about. My dripped out king. I think Dutch is a really good character. I don't like him on a human level, but he's very complex and captivating. I could never pinpoint exactly what he's thinking, and that kept me on my toes throughout the entire game. In the story, Dutch plays the role of a father to Arthur. In fact, he states this multiple times. He's the leader of the Vanderlyn gang and entrusts himself with keeping everyone safe and for the gang to have a better life. On my first playthrough, I never really trusted Dutch, as he gave me weird, slimy vibes. I know you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but sometimes you're right. He always talked very big and highly of himself, and most importantly his plans. Dutch always boasted about having a plan. The plan is to pull off one more heist, get just enough money to catch a boat, and move everyone to Tahiti. The only thing is, this plan never changes, and we have unsuccessfully pulled off our final heist about 5 times in a row by the end of the game. I honestly don't think there was ever a real well thought out plan, just a ploy to string everyone along for as long as he can. More and more members were starting to die as a result of these final heists, and I certainly think Dutch was starting to crack under the pressure, especially after robbing a bank in Saint Denis, which results in the death of Hosea, his partner in crime. This is when Dutch undoubtedly lost his mind. Dutch and Hosea worked together as the leads of the camp. Hosea was Dutch's North Star, always keeping him on the right path. If Dutch was being too brash or hasty, Hosea would always push back. With Hosea out of the picture, Dutch's mind has free reign, and it's not helping that the evil Micah Bell got in his ear. Micah is a character you're meant to hate. He seems to have reckless abandon and doesn't seem to care about or be loyal to anyone he views as weak or inferior. Even at the beginning of the game, he was complaining about there being too many mouths to feed. He always wanted to get rid of the people he felt were not pulling their weight, and with Hosea dead, he now has the opportunity to make that dream a reality. I don't think Micah really changed Dutch's mind on things, but more so enabled him to give in to the undesirable power and money-hungry views he already had. Immediately after finishing the game, I restarted it and I noticed that Dutch and the gang was on a bit of a descent from the very beginning. People in camp were already questioning his psyche and wondering what's gotten into him. I think it's funny that I thought so highly of the gang in terms of their skills, but I've come to realize that we never really saw them in their prime. The botched Blackwater heist was just the tip of the iceberg. Dutch and the gang has been on a downward trajectory since the very beginning. I could honestly yap about a ton of the characters, but I don't really want this video to be too long, as I'm not sure anyone will watch it, so allow me to give some honorable mentions. Since it is Red Dead Redemption, I should probably mention John. John is the protagonist in Red Dead Redemption 1, so I guess he's kind of important, but he kind of takes a backseat throughout this game. I honestly was not the biggest fan of John at all. I've never played the first game, and this is my first impression of him. So yeah, not the best introduction. John plays the role of a deadbeat father for half the game, and even by the end of the epilogue, I'm not convinced he's fully changed. His relationship with his son Jack still seems pretty cold, and yeah, I still don't know how I feel. He ran away from Abigail and Jack for a year, and that still leaves a stain on his character for me. However, just as an update, I am playing through the first game, and he's actually pretty cool. So maybe take John in Red Dead 2 with a grain of salt. One of the characters I love from the beginning, however, is Sadie Adler. Very basic, I know. I loved her from the first time we went to Rhodes with her. I'm glad she made it to the end of the game, as I would have crashed out otherwise. I also feel the same way about Charles. He gives gentle giant energy, and I'm so happy he was able to escape and go to Canada to start a family. I know nobody in the gang is really a good person, but I feel like Charles is one of the more decent members. Which leads me to two of the themes I've noticed throughout the game: loyalty and morality. We see these two themes conflicting multiple times. People want to speak up because they know something is morally wrong, but instead they say nothing because of their loyalty to someone. Nobody in the Vanderlyn gang is good or a morally sound person. Yes, even Charles and the women. I mean, even though they boast about having morals in the beginning of the game, money, greed, and pure desperation are the reasons that frequently override that same moral code. It's not until deep moral lines are repeatedly crossed that people start to take a stand against a person, despite the loyalty they feel they are owed. Honestly, if loyalty was such a big deal to characters like Dutch, he would trust what Arthur and John had to say about Micah. But sadly, in Dutch's mind, loyalty only works in one direction. I think you can also throw in the family dynamic and grooming into reasons as to why it took so long for certain members to turn on Dutch. Arthur and John were both taken in by Dutch from a young age, so this is the only way of living that they know from Dutch's perspective. It's harder to rebel when you feel like you owe someone everything, but I feel like Arthur and John openly discussing Dutch's descent into madness and how guilty they feel letting it slide for so long made them a lot more comfortable taking a stand against him. They worked together to close out the Vanderlyn gang's final chapter with the least amount of lives lost as possible. I truly wasn't expecting to like this game as much as I did. The characters are what really drive my love for it. I truly cared for Arthur and the Vanderlyn gang in general by the end of the game. Okay, well, some of the Vanderlyn gang. I wasn't expecting to make a video for this game, but I feel like I had to have a little yapping session because I've been obsessed with it. It honestly might be my new favorite game. These were just my first opinions of the game. I am replaying it again as we speak, and I already feel like I'm gaining more and more insight on characters and the story in general. I really enjoyed seeing Arthur's race against the clock for redemption, and it honestly made his death more impactful. Although, as much as it pains me to say, I'm not sure Arthur was really redeemed for his past actions. Anyways, if you have any similar game recommendations, please let me know in the comments below. As always, my name is Andy, and I hope to see you in the next video.